Trzeba zrobić pokaz slajdów.
No jeden slajd może być, albo dwa. Albo jak się da, to byłoby fajne. Ladies and gentlemen, we will start. Proszę o zajęcie miejsc.
Please take your seats.
Cześć.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Wasze Blażeństwo, Cher Monsieur le Président Hollande, Szanowny Premier Minister Yatsenyuk, dear ministers, dear ambassadors, dear guests, dear students, dear participants. I would like to welcome you warmly at the College of Europe in Natolin. I want to extend special warm welcome to our guest of honor today, His Beatitude Sviatoslav Shevchuk, Major Archbishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Mr. François Hollande, the former President of France, Mr. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine. I would also like to welcome all the eminent guests who have agreed to share with us their rich experience and expertise. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and your presence here today. Dear all, welcome to the Symposium, Revolution, War and Their Consequences, which sums up yet another stage of the major research project, Three Ukrainian Revolutions. This project is carried out in the College of Europe in Natolin by an international academic team under the leadership of Dr. Paweł Kowal and Professor Mink in the framework of the European Civilization Chair at Natolin. The chair is led by Professor Richard Butterwick. The project for Ukrainian Revolutions has been in place for a few years now. Let me only recall that we have launched this project in cooperation with partner institutions specializing in the history of Ukraine and Central Eastern Europe. Let me thank for their involvement and for their support the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta, le Centre d'études des mondes caucasiens et Centre européen de l'École des hautes études en sciences sociales in Paris, the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies of the University College London, the Center for East European Studies of the University of Warsaw, and the Institute of Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Dear guests, one may ask why we talk about Ukrainian affairs at the College of Europe, a European educational institution which first and foremost prepares young people for careers in wider European affairs. There are several answers to these questions, not all of them as obvious as one might assume. The College of Europe, as many of us know, started its activities in 1949 in Bruges, in Belgium, only a few years after the end of the Second World War, in the atmosphere of post-war détente, but also amidst the mounting tensions between the West and the East. The initiative to set up such an educational institution was directly related not only to a planned creation of new European institutions and structures, but also to prepare a new generation of Europeans who, despite their painful war experience, would be able to cooperate to cooperate for the sake of the common good. For obvious reasons, including the consistent implementation of the provisions of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, this cooperation and the building of the common European destiny were limited only to the countries of Western Europe. Today, we do not want to follow a similar path of exclusion. That is why, in 1992, after the historical changes in Central and Eastern Europe and fall of communism, the College of Europe, upon the invitation of the Polish government, put its anchor in this part of the continent. As a result of this decision, young people coming from all over Europe gained access to the European educational institution and its academic offer. However, from the moment of its creation, the college was to become not only an educational institution and an enclave for academic work on European studies, but also a forum for discussions and debates on issues that are important for Europe as a region. Dear guests, here in Natolin we believe that it is part of our mission here to undertake research related to contemporary Ukraine. We are convinced that modern history of Ukraine forms part of common history of Europe. Revolutionary outbursts, uprisings, and trends in the strive for freedom, these are part of the heritage of our continent. We at the college educate also on European civilization. It is impossible to do so while omitting the struggles for freedom from Europe's history. We also study modern history of Ukraine because the social change in this country, which is taking place before our very eyes, is one of the most interesting phenomena from the point of view of contemporary research in humanities and social science. We conduct this research also because the European Union has been building the legal and political ties with Ukraine. Regarding the EU-Ukrainian relations, the outcomes of the events of 2014 in Ukraine were decisive here. In the recent years, both sides signed the association agreement and visa-free travel has been introduced. The college in Natolin assists in the implementation of the European integration process of Ukraine. Together with the Polish-American Freedom Foundation, we have trained mid-level and senior officials from Ukraine, including officials from Prime Minister Yatsenyuk's administration. These processes are also subjects of research, therefore we are developing our Ukrainian studies in Natolin. At the same time, we are proud to have educated here at the college more than 90 students from Ukraine within our regular one-year advanced master program. The reason why we are meeting here today at the college at Natolin is to talk not only about the past, but also about the future. In a free and strong Ukraine, Europe sees a partner for building stability across the continent. I believe that this will happen in not so distant future. That the war, which is still smoldering, will soon die down. Time seems to work for Ukraine's benefit, and we send the country our warm thoughts. Dear guests, once again, thank you very much for your presence here today. Now I would like to give the floor to President François Hollande, who between 2012 and 2017 as the head of state was personally involved in resolving the tragic developments in eastern Ukraine. Monsieur le Président, c'est un grand honneur pour nous de vous accueillir au Collège Natolin. Nous vous remercions de vouloir partager avec nous votre expérience Je vous laisse la parole, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
Madame la Rectrice.
Madam Rector, thank you very much for this invitation to this college, which has a very strong reputation and which has been installed here since over 20 years with a great capacity to educate successive generations of students. We've had the opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister present here when we were in charge, and now we are coming back looking towards the past, but also trying to assess the future and the risks involved. So I hope that the Prime Minister will also share his experience. I would just like to look back at my role in the course of the Ukrainian crisis and what then resulted in the Minsk agreements. At the time, there was a whole configuration of events. There was the Maidan, a revolution, a president who had been elected in Ukraine, Mr. Yushchenko, and the Russian intervention in the Crimea, carrying great risks for Europe and for the world. Member states of G8, with the exception of Russia, considered that it wasn't possible to meet at a summit which was supposed to take place in Sochi in the format of G8. With regards to Russia, we needed to give it a signal understandable for everyone, including President Putin, that the attachment of the Crimea to Russia could not be accepted by the international community, and therefore this couldn't take place without international consent. Given that there was no contact between the key G8 countries and Russia, there was no mutual understanding. So we took part in an important event, which was the anniversary of the disembarkation, which was planned for June, and it was my task to determine the list of invited parties. So it had to do with the liberation of France, so all the parties involved needed to be invited. And the question arose, what about Russia, which didn't take part in the liberation of France in 1944 directly? But the courage of the Russian people and the Red Army on the Eastern Front had, of course, contributed to the defeat of Nazi Russia. So, Nazi Germany, sorry. So, especially Angela, in consultation with Angela Merkel, I consulted the Russian President, Mr. Putin, but also President Poroshenko, who had just been elected President of Ukraine. So this double invitation gave the opportunity to have the Russian and the Ukrainian presidents present together. Mr. Putin, accepting the invitation to these celebrations, was aware that the newly elected Ukrainian president would be there as well, as an official guest, although he didn't recognize the legality of his election. So this meeting, four-party meeting, took place in the format of the presidents of Ukraine, Russia, Chancellor of Germany, and myself at a dinner. And this meeting gave birth to the birth of the so-called Normandy format. So following this, we had a process of discussions and negotiations to find a way out of the crisis linked to the annexation of the Crimea by Russia. This, of course, could be challenged by other parties, other countries, like especially the United States, which ought to have played a role in this process. But President Obama decided that it was up to the Europeans to find a solution or to assist those concerned in finding such a solution. And of course, Poland could have shared this preoccupation of finding it suitable for itself to participate in the process. But following dialogue, it was decided that especially it was up to France and Germany as the initiators to assure European consent on this. Hence the Normandy format. It enabled also to sign a ceasefire on in September 2014, and at a NATO meeting of the heads of governments and states to ratify this process. But then military activities, combats re-emerged with numerous victims. So we repeated our efforts, and Angela Merkel realized that by the end of 2014 we were able to re-initiate our initiative, relaunch it. So we met in Russia and in Ukraine, and at the occasion we reviewed opportunities for another meeting in the Normandy format to try to arrive at agreements providing a framework for the resolution of the crisis. After several attempts, we decided to meet in Minsk in early February 2015. And there were major challenges here for the parties concerned. At Minsk, Mr. Putin was playing for time. The separatists, supported by the Russians, even as they denied their presence there, they were seeking to gain as much territory as they could. And they were seeking to be recognized by the international community as a subject, as an entity in its rights. Following the decisions of 2014 on the part of Russia to annex the Crimea. Another intention on the part of Putin was to to gain a permanent foothold for the control or for influence, at least, over Ukraine. So as soon as possible, trying to avoid human losses, casualties. There was also the quest to arrive at a ceasefire again, and also to establish a permanent border. So for President Poroshenko, there was, on the other hand, the effort to seek support of the European powers to assure a European perspective for Ukraine and to defend its borders. So intentions were to assure, on the part of Germany, in turn, to maintain relations with Russia and to use them to prevent conflict at the expense of economic and political relations, maintaining at the same time good relations with France. For France, which was interested in an Eastern Partnership, which had already several times shown its interest in the east of Europe, gaining stability and security of a stable nature. And for us, the neighborhood of Europe, not only with the South, with its historical roots, but we were also keen about relations with the east of Europe.
Arriving in Minsk, we didn't know whether we were going to achieve the agreement. So from that point of view, we weren't sure, and we spent the entire night negotiating. And I think that for Putin, that was not a problem, spending the whole night. I thought at the same time that for him, it was his reason was to get the negotiators fatigued and to gain time to show his interest in the negotiations. He did not want to interrupt them. For President Poroshenko, it was vital to leave the room with an agreement, given what the situation was in field. We knew that writing the agreement over the night, and then when the morning came, we had found the different points that allowed us to reach a consensus. So the retrieving the army, reviewing the constitution, local elections in the framework of the Ukrainian law, and then at the end of the process, a comeback to the control of the border. So we thought at the time that we were able to announce the agreement, and Putin had announced that separatists were involved. In any case, he thought he was able to now give his opinion. The discussions were suspended. I don't know where the separatists were at the time, whether they were in a room next door or in a different hotel. But they stayed at home. Still, 1 or 2 hours later, we were told that the separatists did not accept the agreement. Donc me and Ms. Merkel started discussing with President Putin, who said that he wasn't able to exert pressure on the separatists. We were not sure whether he was actually telling the truth or not at the time. And after 2 hours of discussing the issue with President Putin, he was able to join the separatists that he said he hadn't known, and then impose the restrictions on the agreement. So at 10 a.m. we returned and we were able to establish the balance of the negotiations. The advantage that he had was that he was able to get to that situation. Still, this was organized so that the intervention of Putin could take place as late as possible, which allowed him to conquer yet another city, which was his goal, and that of the separatists. Still, the ceasefire 48 hours later was announced officially, and it was largely observed in the following days, and that was the first achievement of the Minsk agreement. Further on, a process continued that was going to be implemented, which was a sort of a roadmap that was not fully observed. Still, it constituted a certain framework. Now let me move on to the evaluation of the situation in the current reality. A number of meetings were held in the Normandy framework after Minsk. There were 3 of them, namely, and they all confirmed what this roadmap should look like and how it should be implemented. We know the obstacles. So the exchange of prisoners was not fully completed. There were still armed forces and militia. The local elections were not carried out according to the Ukrainian law as was promised, and the constitution was not reviewed and amended. But the roadmap allows us to address the President of Russia and to request its implementation. So if you look at the balance of the loss of human lives that was reduced at least 6-fold in 2017 compared to the time of taking those actions. There was a number of meetings that were held which made it possible to regulate certain cases. Also, hard weapons were withdrawn. So the balance is not completely negative. However, it is not fully positive either, to say it bluntly. And there are certain frameworks that will continue over the following months. However, Russia's intention is to maintain its position and to freeze the conflict. And this is what's taking place in Ukraine and unfortunately other countries as well. It is the intention of Russia's president to continue making an impact on the future fate of Ukraine. Certainly he is not aware of the attachment of Ukraine to the Western world. He is currently running an offensive in Syria, and he may not open a battlefront in all the locations. Still, if he doesn't want to conquer following lands, because he's already conquered Crimea, it is definitely his intention to maintain the status quo so that it lasts as it is right now. And what the international community should do is not accept what has been done, either Crimea, what happened there, or the reality in the East, which is harmful for Ukraine and hence for Europe, for all of Europe. And therefore the Normandy framework remains very valuable and useful still, because it enables justifying to the European Council the extension of the sanctions that were imposed. My concern over the recent years that have passed is that at some point there will be a division between Europeans, that some will start requiring that the sanctions be lifted. But once we have the roadmap, the Minsk protocol, and if it's not effectively implemented, we're looking at all the conditions that are needed to maintain the sanctions. Someone could ask whether they are in fact effective. Yes, indeed, it is a reasonable question to ask. They are reasonable, they are effective, because if they were in place, nobody, especially in Russia, would be asking for the removal of these sanctions. They are harmful for European countries, also for France. I will get back to that. But they're also effective because they penalize Russian economy as well, and the people who are accountable for the breach of law. France, and I advocated that. I wanted to extend the sanctions to energy as well. In my opinion, this would have been most effective as an action against Russia. And some countries, and I will not point my finger, but not wanting to offend anybody, also in my current capacity, some countries that are very much linked to Russia, especially from the energetic point of view, did not want these sanctions to be extended, and that never happened. But from the French point of view, it was unacceptable for France to deliver weapons and armaments to Russia. It is true that an agreement was concluded, decided upon by my predecessor and President Putin, on delivering 2 Mistral vessels. For those of you who are not familiar with the armaments, they are helicopter-carrying vessels that might be useful or could be used by Russia in the Ukrainian crisis against Ukraine. So a demand was made to nullify those delivery of those Mistral vessels, to cancel those deliveries, even though the contracts had been finalized by then, and the sanctions then did not really concern the delivery of military equipment, but this triggered a financial impact of around 1 billion euros for France, because that was the value of the contract. However, I took the decision, even though I was still involved in the Normandy format discussions and I really wanted a global agreement to be concluded. Still, I made the decision to cancel that contract, and ultimately it was completely cancelled in August 2015, which was after the Minsk agreement. So let me conclude here. If we want the agreements to be followed, if we want the law to be respected, if we want especially Russia to contribute to solving the problems that it caused itself and the conflicts that it initiated, we need to get well equipped with measures, and those measures are discussion, dialogue, negotiation, diplomacy. But other measures are also forceful measures, such as sanctions, non-delivery of equipment, breaking some energy contracts, and sometimes military measures. We need to be aware that only force may lead to political agreements. If there is no force, then politics will encounter a border very soon. And I think that the Minsk agreement corresponds to what was necessary to be done at the time, but their implementation definitely requires will on the part of the Europeans to complete all the measures so that Ukraine can regain its territorial integrity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dziękuję bardzo panu prezydentowi.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for in fact leading us to the essence of the deliberations of today's symposium. Also, thank you very much for your personal account, which is a very important element of our study, your personal reconstruction of events and memories. And the next speaker that will take the floor, as our habit demands, we will also have a panel discussion around the table with our distinguished guests. But right now, let me give the floor to Arseniy Yatsenyuk, one of the main protagonists of the events at the time, during the revolution and soon afterwards, the person who, in fact, bore the first difficulties of what Ukraine experienced. So we're looking forward to hearing your account.
Ваше блаженство, вельмишановний пане президенте, шановна аудиторія.
Your Holiness, President, ladies and gentlemen, a great title, 3 revolutions. It must be said what Ukrainians fought for and are still fighting for. What was the purpose of those 3 revolutions? We are fighting for our dignity and we are fighting for our statelyhood. Our dignity are the principles that the European Union was built upon. The dignity versus the rights and liberties of citizen and human. The dignity towards us as the Ukrainian nation and the dignity of every individual that wants to live in a free country, that wants to speak freely, that wants to grow, and who does not want to be under the yoke of the new Soviet Union, of Putin, and our own state is something that we have lost over the course of history, the statehood that we have been able to renew, that we see inside the framework of the European Union. The European Union is the future for us. The European Union, for you, is everyday life. And it is important for that historical and geopolitical project that the European Union is to be maintained and to develop. So how may projects develop? They may develop only if they enlarge. And for Europe to be stronger, we need not be afraid that of Ukraine being a member of United Europe, because it's a win-win both for Europe and Ukraine. Inside the European Union, there are some tendencies that go from the center outward, and Brexit is one of such tendencies, and it undermines the very project of the European Union. You can see the wave of populist philosophies in many member states of the European Union, which is based on one unique thing, on anti-European goals. Populists use that to gain power. They gain power by basing their discourse on false thesis, and if we exit Europe, the nations of this and that country will have a better life. But that is not true. The truth is that a united and strong Europe also makes European citizens stronger. Also, separately, I'd like to emphasize the role of the Franco-German alliance. Mr. President here had a good report, not just to the German Chancellor, who, by the way, has been elected for the 4th time to her office. I do like the Constitution of Germany, Mr. President. The French President and the German Chancellor demonstrated that they were the political leaders. Also, because they were prepared to support Ukraine and to defend European values. Our brothers, Poles, and it's a great honor for me to be able to address a Polish audience here in Poland, then I'd like to thank you very much for preparing such a good conference. So being in Poland, I must say that our relations, those between Poland and Ukraine, to be diplomatic, are not in a very good shape at the moment. And that is unacceptable, because we're not just neighbors, we're not just close to one another, we are those countries and those nations that have experienced a lot in the past, and that should do everything to benefit the future. I understand the necessity for the need for historical dialogue, and I value it, but we must not live only in the past, only in history. We should learn to care about history, but also to create future and to contribute to the future. And that's why I am convinced that we will find the force within to demonstrate to all, including Russia, which is only clapping its hands and enjoying the tension between us. We need to show Russia that we are wise and that we will not let anyone destroy the Polish and Ukrainian unity. What are the threats that we're facing? First of all, there's a threat to security and the existence of the free world as such. So who personifies that threat? Russia of President Putin personifies that threat. Mr. President Hollande, in his intervention, gave very clear signs and told us how, with his own contribution and that of Ms. Merkel, the Minsk agreements were signed. And the president said that Putin allegedly had said that he had no influence over this, the Donetsk and Lugansk separatists. And the president also thought, I'm not sure if he said, if Putin was telling the truth at the time or not, but Putin is said that they weren't his people that invaded Crimea. He had probably forgotten about this later on. So later on, he said in the documentary that he was the person that had planned the operations aiming at breaching the international law and the UN law and the Ukrainian border. So he confirmed that he had broken European law and committed a crime. He was also truthful when he was saying that it was not his weapon that shot the MH17 planes, because the separatists knew themselves how to operate missiles. He is also telling the truth right now when he's saying that it's not the Russian intelligence system that has poisoned Russian citizen in England. So for us and for Europe, what is the threat is Russia, and it's a threat for us, for Europe, and for free world as such. And let me emphasize again the role of President Hollande and Ms. Merkel in the signing of the Minsk agreements. We vary in our assessment of the Minsk agreements, but what I want to say is that Minsk was an agreement to cease fire and to cease the Russian invasion. These were good intentions on our part to regulate the situation that was created on the diplomatic and political scene. But Minsk was not fully implemented because Putin doesn't want it. Putin is a champion in creating various frozen conflicts, and the more such conflicts he has, the more chaos ensues in the world. And he is a master of chaos, and that weakens the free world.
Які наші відповіді повинні бути?
So what should be our response to this? First of all, concerning security, our common security, it's in the interest of our common securities not only to enlarge the EU but also to strengthen our alliances. Unfortunately, Ukraine wasn't granted membership in NATO with the consequence of aggression in Georgia and Ukraine. So the strengthening of security, following the words of President Hollande, is our strength which can grant us the opportunity with the use of our diplomats to enhance our stability, our strength, not only in the military sense, but also our energy security. In relation to this, the question emerges: what is the priority, business, the economy, or values? And the awareness of energy-related challenges for EU member states arising from Nord Stream 2, which is an anti-Ukrainian, anti-Polish project, also targeted against Slovakia and Europe as a whole. How can you support a project by means of which Russia will gain control of the European energy market? How can you support a project led by Russian Gazprom group, which doesn't observe the verdict of the Stockholm arbitrage, which we have won, which cuts the flow of gas through Ukraine's pipelines to prevent Ukraine from meeting its obligations towards Europe. And we value the support of the EU. We obtain $1 billion in loans every year from the EU. How can we support projects which completely make Europe dependent on a politically led company under the tutelage of President Putin? So, together with our friends in Poland, we are of the opinion that the Nord Stream project is to the detriment of Europe's security, and we hope that the European Commission and the EU member states will take a decision which will be favorable for our future and Europe's future. What we need? We need a strong leader, a leader in our struggle for our values and for our security. We need a leader favoring the enlargement of both the EU and NATO and seeking rational solutions for issues in our contemporary world. So this common sense approach should protect us against threats and make us stronger. So a rational common sense approach should demonstrate that the values of the free world not only have a right of existence, but that they are stronger than dictators and tyrants, and that they allow us to overcome the chaos which is emerging all over the world. So our unity and our leadership is what can lead us to success in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Especially at our last year's conference, it emerged that we underestimate the significance of the spiritual aspects in these events, and especially of the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. So I would like to ask His Excellency the Archbishop, how do you see the role of the Church and the religion in developing civil society in a country emerging from communism, looking to the future? So we are very happy that we have the opportunity to ask this question to the Archbishop, who is invited to the floor.
Dostojna Pani Dyrektor, Panie Prezydenty.
Madam Rector, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, and distinguished participants of this conference, God bless you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to be in the company of distinguished statesmen and politicians to say that in contemporary society we also have a church. When we talk about Ukraine's society, it is appropriate to mention the fact that the church is present there and what is its role. Of course, a quarter of an hour doesn't allow the possibility to elaborate extensively on the question raised, but I would like to focus on the role of the Church in the social transformation of the Ukrainian people today. So I would like to note three key points. First, how today, in line with the social teaching of the Church, how do we appraise social structures? Second, what is the role of the Church in society? And third, what is our task for the Ukrainian society to assure that the challenge of political transformation and the enlargement of European unity in line with the challenges mentioned by Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, what is the role of the teaching of the Church in this context? So first, we perceive the society as structured as follows. We have the political and government administration structures. We have political processes with political parties. And there are business entities and economic activities in societies. Everything else is civil society. Society of ordinary rank-and-file citizens, not centered around any political structure, any political party, or business interests, but simply people realizing tasks which they perceive as tasks for the nation. And people organize themselves to be masters of their destiny, building their future. The Church perceives its role as part of civil society. Its integral part. I remember how Archimandrite Cyril from the Orthodox Church claimed that about relations between government and the church, there is also a relation between the church and society, the nation, the people, that the church should address people and their conscience, those people who are the fabric of the future of society. So the church perceives and understands society in its own way, and even the Orthodox Church begins to recognize the existence of civil society. So the church is also a phenomenon reflecting the existence of civil society in Ukraine. You know that in a totalitarian state you can't seriously talk of civil society, which is either physically destroyed or is driven underground or simply doesn't exist. So a dignity revolution in our understanding of social developments is a revelation, is a phenomenon of civil society. I'm sure you all know that initially there were two Maidans, a social one, a spontaneous one, and a political one. And they emerged in different places. The civil Maidan was at the Independence Square and the political one at another location. But then the politicians joined the people at the Independence Maidan. And as a church, as the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, we understood that that our place is with the people, not with business, not with government, not with the state, but with the people, with the nation who rose in demand of their own, of respect for their own dignity. So you need, even if you become aware of your own dignity, this already drives revolution. And that's the key principle at the same time of the social teaching by the Church. And it's the key principle of European civilization. And secondly, it is obvious that the European Greek Catholic Church has always been with the nation. Our church has always been part and mother, as it were, of Ukrainian civil society. In times when we didn't have our own state, the church fulfilled functions which were absent in state structures. For example, Archbishop Szeptycki was not only an ethnarch of the Ukrainian nation, but also under the conditions of independent Republic of Poland between the world wars, he was able to develop Ukrainian business entities with a Ukrainian bank, with structures in the country. The followers of this, the heirs of Szeptycki's bank today form national structures taken over by the state. Or the imprisoning in Stalinist prison camps of Patriarch Slipy when he was released in 1962. He was regarded by the international community as if he were an informal president of Ukraine behind the Iron Curtain. despite the fact that he was kind of enslaved. So when we talk about the 20th century, the European Greek Catholic Church was one of the largest Christian communities which was persecuted. Talking about the Soviet Union, we were the largest opposition group against communist rule in the Soviet Union. And even the Soviet Union wasn't unable to destroy it. It's obvious that after the rebirth of Ukrainian statehood, there was a stage of the emergence of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church from underground, which was one of the triggers, one of the initiators of social and political change in Ukraine. So our Greek Catholic Church, joined later by other churches in Ukraine, was not only part of society but also one of the best organized parts of our civil society. We have various religious and social organizations, communities, which are so sometimes branded as fake communities in times where everything is falsified, including civil society. But Ukrainian churches enjoy the greatest confidence of our nation, maybe even excessive confidence. We haven't we don't deserve this, but we do feel a huge responsibility given the trust placed in us. So under current conditions, the task of all Ukrainian churches is to remain part of civil society. On the one hand, there is this the risk of becoming too closely bound to the state and being involved in political processes, which is a short-lived approach, because being connected to political structures or parties leads to discreditation of the church during successive elections. There is also the risk of the church becoming part of an oligarchy, where a great oligarch simply buys into a church in order for it to serve its interests. So today we have the challenge of staying with society, with civil society, and it is also a historical choice on the part of the church. And the third aspect, how we perceive today our role, our task, our mission. The paramount tasks for our church, and I mean not only as part of a religious community, but also as a community of believers, regardless of membership of any particular church. The church should be a leader, a spiritual leader for society. We have an organization which is called the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Civil Society. It joins all three Orthodox churches, all Catholic churches, both in the Latin and in the Greek Byzantine tradition, and even Protestant churches, and also the Judaic faith. The head rabbi of Ukraine calls this council the largest NGO of Ukraine. So, being so different and yet united, we try to elevate ourselves above the differences across our faiths and to speak with one voice to the people of Ukraine. And here we are united by the quest for the common good. The truth which we need to tell people, politicians and business, is that goodness is above all. And one of the key internal problems of Ukraine is the issue of corruption. Everyone is fighting corruption. The international community above and the quest for anti-corruption institutions inside Ukraine. If we don't understand within the country that corruption is a moral evil, that it's a sin, unless we build up a national front against this evil, we won't succeed. And we cannot get rid of corruption in Ukraine by external means. We won't be able to get our hands on all the corrupt men. So our church has started teaching the people against corruption together with even the Protestant Church, instructing the churchmen also how to react to confessions of corruption. So we have announced a new intolerance for corruption, a moral intolerance. As Christians, we should understand that this is moral evil just as bad as as what we are told from the outside world. And another contemporary example. Tomorrow elections will be held in the Russian Federation, and we are aware that the winds are blowing from that side, trying to discredit elections as such in society, because in many countries elections are turned into a big show and people are disillusioned. They find that there are no candidates worthy of voting for. So churches and religious organizations in Ukraine teach the believers that it is a civil obligation to participate in elections. So we encourage everybody to vote, to take part in elections, and we launch a campaign of prayers for just and fair elections. We are also we have an election campaign already in progress before subsequent elections next year. So we are trying to educate people to become fair and just politicians, businessmen who would be responsible to the people. And finally, I would like to end on a positive note. In May 2014, following the drama of the events in Odessa, At the time I was in Canada meeting the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada, and they were telling me such terrible things are happening in Ukraine. Do you have any hope? And I said, yes, of course we have hope as Christians. And all the doubts then disappeared. So looking at our rank-and-file citizens who strive to build their own free and independent country, ready to sacrifice their lives for it. And so I see the future of the Ukraine in its people. So I appeal to you to believe in the future for Ukraine. Do feel the voice of the people who are building up Europe in Ukrainian society. So I thank you for your solidarity, and I appeal to you to have faith in Ukraine.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. I think that those three interventions preceded by our rector's introduction have given us a lot of food for thought in our debate. We've got a lot of other issues on our agenda. Now, let me ask you to take the seats that we've prepared. This is not the end of our deliberations. We will be taking advantage of your presence in a moment. Now, a short video to prepare us for the following part of our seminar.
Dziękuję bardzo telewizji.
Thank you very much to the Express Television for preparing that short video. Let me now take the liberty to invite to our table here Mr. President, Prime Minister and Archbishop. We are holding part of our debate. At the table we ask questions, but we also have participants to our debate. So gentlemen, please join us. My name is Paweł Kowal. Three of us here, Professor Mink, Professor Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski, we work together on the Three Revolutions project. It is our job to ask questions as well. So, starting from Professor Mink.
Micro.
Je m'adresse à vous, Monsieur le Président.
I would like to address Mr. President. First of all, let me make a short comment on yourself and France, often in the east of Europe, we doubt France because we think that France has nothing in common with Russia, except for the Napoleonian era. But the tradition, the Gaullist tradition, has marked France. So I'm very happy to be sitting here in front of you because you completely abolished this hypothesis, and I think that the rejection of the Minstrel contract was a great signal that France was going to support Ukraine and international law, which was overtly violated by the annexation of the Crimea on one hand and by the violation of the law when we think about the Budapest Memorandum, which we do not mention too often. So I have a number of questions towards you and France. You have given an interview very recently that maybe not all of us have yet read, and in this interview you take position versus what's happening in Russia at the moment, and very clearly you also describe what a hybrid war is and what Putin's role is in that war. And you have also stated a phrase: if Russia is menacing, it has to be menaced. Could you elaborate on that thought, please? It's true that there are historical relations and political relations between Russia and France, and I expressed that in a book where Russian authors are present. Between the Russian nation and the French nation there are deep relationships. I mentioned the Second World War, but let's not forget about the Red Army's sacrifice that has contributed to the victory. In the Gaullist era that you have mentioned, there have been relations with the Soviet Union that enabled France to be an independent country and to define its relations with the world without being an ally subordinated to the US, even if the US remains a French ally. Well, this policy by no means is to say that we wanted to get into the service. Let me advance here. Later on, I will not list all my predecessors, but there have been some attempts to appease them, or perhaps more precisely an illusion or an impression that it is possible, as a result of a discussion only, to get from the Soviet Union certain concessions that would allow us to solve the conflicts. I concluded that Putin's return to power in 2012 brought about some changes. That is to say, that he started becoming more and more offensive in his actions. He claimed that Russia's abstentions during the Security Council's meeting on Libya and its opposition to all the resolutions on Syria. He considered himself the defender of Christian values against the world of Islam, and he did that for reasons of internal national security, but also his perception of the exterior. And deliberately, he wanted to make an impact on every particular occasion, and that the same was true for the Ukrainian question and Syria. The case of Syria is very interesting because it is for the first time that Russian intervention took place since Afghanistan. And taking into account all the risks and threats. Now, for Ukraine, Putin put into place the exact same scenario as he had done in Moldova or Georgia, but to a much larger scale. He very much cares about his external image. He wants to be a global actor, not just a regional one. And last but not least, he is testing the relations between the nations of the West and Europe. And he also is sort of obsessed towards the USA because he was educated in the Soviet system. So taking all that into account, I considered that when I was president of France, that we needed to demonstrate not just the will to negotiate and to have a dialogue, but we needed to oppose the offensive of Vladimir Putin. And I warned my European partners and told them that they must not just be satisfied with imposing limited sanctions. I told them that they were facing a situation that could be potentially a threat to their security. I think that we're at in a different dimension right now after Donald Trump was elected president in the United States, who I think constitutes an additional threat due to his unpredictability. And this poses a question to Europe with reference to its defense organization and its ability to put in place measures ensuring independence and security. This is something that I'm deeply convinced of. I think that Europe is facing a moment of truth. It may not consider that only economy is giving it the appropriate measures to act. If we want to be a power, we need to have measures that will ensure our independence. Economy is part of that, but defense is also a very important element. I am also a little bit Polish, not just French, and I would like to go back to the Normandy framework because Poles were not included in that framework. They played an important role at the end of 2013 in the Weimar Triangle, and also they had very good expertise due to the proximity. So could you say a little bit more on that? I know that you were friends with President Komorowski at the time. So why was there a complete veto by Putin in this regard? Or perhaps would have been more diplomatic to play that card in such a way? The person that was mostly opposed to the party that was mostly opposed to the Normandy framework was the United States. The United States thought that they had a role to play and that theirs was a significant contribution to the solution of the Ukrainian issue. Poland indeed had a role to play, but this should not be part of this format. What determines the effectiveness of the Normandy format was the fact that France, for the first time, took measures concerning Eastern Europe in a deliberate manner from the political point of view, and that Germany gave Putin a guarantee. So if we wanted to impose sanctions and to extend sanctions, it was important not to make it more difficult to act on the European scale and to only have France and Germany in that process. Of course, drawing on the opinions of the Polish authorities. Now, Professor Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski.
Address my question to you, Prime Minister. Please excuse me for not asking it in Ukrainian. As Dr. Kowal has said, you became Prime Minister at a time of extraordinary difficulties and challenges, both internally and externally. On reflection, now that a couple of years have passed, Is there anything, whether in domestic or in foreign policy, that you would have done differently?
If the time will come, and for example, you personally will decide to run for any kind of political office, I can tell you my take. Never do what I did. But if you want to make your country stronger, and if you really want to get real legacy of your tenureship, do what we've done. During my last trip to DC, because there are a number of talks, or with the IMF program, or with the financial package for Ukraine, or with the way how the anti-corruption court is to be facilitated, and the rest of the stuff. And there is some kind of, it's somewhere in the air, it smells in the air, a notorious definition of Ukrainian fatigue. So in order to disseminate this notorious stuff, I presented in the United States, and I would be happy to give it to you, a very simple data, fact check book. Facts, not fakes. If you go to the United States, you have always mentioned fakes. And in this particular data, you can see what has been done. Okay? This is an impressive record of strong, bold, tough, one can say unpopular, but reasonable, robust, and necessary reforms in my country. It's normal when in your political life you go ups and downs. Every time when you are down, you have to climb up. Every single time. And the same goes with the country. My take is that we are moving in a very right direction. And it's up to the Ukrainian leadership, and it's up to the Ukrainian people to make the country stronger and more prosperous. What I should do different, I will tell you like this. In my next office, I will definitely correct all mistakes.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I have a question to Archbishop. I must say that I wasn't the only person that was impressed by the way you openly spoke about the role of the Church. This is not very common. Very often Church representatives very generally draw on the tasks of the test. So let me take the liberty, given the formula of this symposium, to ask a very sincere question. Do you think politicians, opinion leaders in Ukraine appreciate this spiritual aspect, but also the social aspect of the role of the Church, whereby the role of the Church should be seen as one of the main driving forces of the creation of civil society? In your work, would you say that you've noticed that this is an important issue for politicians, or is it a surprise that this is being raised occasionally? I think both yes and no, frankly. Frankly speaking, we really have a lot of good Christians among politicians who work according to their own conscience. And one must admit that they often come to just talk about themselves, the life and the state, but they address the Church to get the response to difficult questions. For example, why has this happened to us? Is it worth continuing the fight? Or should we give up? What are the values the basic values that we must implement in our policies. And in Ukraine, such a dialogue does exist. But now, on the other hand, we sometimes feel that there is a great temptation to treat the church instrumentally, or at least to discredit it, failing that. And this always happens in the election campaigns, always before an upcoming election. Then dialogue is not so easy, but it does exist. And when we look at open-mindedness, well, I always try to be myself, and I try to speak my mind without insulting anyone, but to be the witness to the truth. Let me be honest, what's happened so far has been very interesting. We're not in a position to shorten that or interrupt it, but we have some time limits. So let me now correct our agenda slightly. Let me ask you to remain here with us till the end of our session. We've got enough time for everyone. I will ask more experts to join us, and I will now ask Ambassador Fried to take the floor. And if you wish, let me ask Mr. Borys Tarasyuk to join the table. He's very well known, so I'm going to save time by skipping the introduction. He's been Foreign Minister of Ukraine twice, great expert in diplomacy. I learn from him very often. Stefan Gullgren, the ambassador of Sweden in Poland currently, but is here in his capacity of one of the witnesses of the events at the time in Ukraine, a great expert in Ukrainian policy and an ambassador there. We've got Danylo Lubkivsky, a former head of Arseniy's cabinet, Arseniy Yatsenyuk's cabinet at the difficult time that we've just described. Professor Kataryna Wolczuk, please join us. She researches Ukraine and the Ukrainian-European relations at the Birmingham University. We've got Igor Gretskiy. Igor is a professor at the Petersburg University. And we have Andreas Umland. Please join us. German point of view, perspective on the events. And we have Przemysław Żurawski, Grajewski, professor and advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Poland, and a great expert in Eastern policy and all the issues related to the transformation in Ukraine, to the history of Ukraine, etc. And now let's consider that the second session has started. The first session that was going to be chaired by Ambassador Daniel Fried. I will ask you to do so, sir, and then following that we will all have a discussion, and then I will include the audience. Should I introduce the ambassador, I wonder? He's a well-known friend to Poland and Ukraine, and well-known in the US. This has been expressed in many capacities and many offices that he's held, among which the ambassador to Poland. But what is important from our point of view as well, a representative of the US government for sanctions that were the consequence of the Ukraine events. Ambassador, over to you. Thank you.
I was inspired by all the speakers, and I want in particular to recognize the role of President Hollande, who made the sanctions possible and who led the way, along with Chancellor Merkel, for the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords are imperfect, but they are perfectly sufficient. They provide a framework for Putin to settle the problem if Putin wants to settle the problem. And without France, we would not have sanctions. And the French decision on the Mistral was a powerful one, and it showed Putin that the West was serious. And I've wanted an occasion to thank him, and now, thanks to this conference, I do. But the question is, what is the international significance of the three revolutions? And I would put the question this way: why Ukraine? Why does it matter? Why is it important? No po co Ukraina? Right? Jakie jest znaczenie dla nas?
What is the significance for us?
The issue at stake in Ukraine is whether or not the West of free institutions is now confined to its borders where it exists, or whether it can continue to welcome in additional Europeans who want to join our community of freedom. That is what is at stake. That's serious business, because the end of Yalta Europe after 1989 touches us all. That is a deep, the end of Yalta ended the 20th century with a moment of vindication for the values of the West. Values which we thought were lost in the mid-20th century. 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson issued his 14 points. The major import of those 14 points is that the Americans rejected a world of spheres of influence in favor of a world of freedom. Now, it was not actually Wilson's idea. The original thought belongs to Immanuel Kant. And if anybody questions that, go read his theory of perpetual peace between republics. Wilson took those European ideas and, in a burst of well-known American idealism and confidence, tried to actually achieve it. Now, we Americans did not succeed. We retreated from Wilson's vision, and we were not present in Europe in the 1930s. And as an American, I'm not particularly proud of that, because the result was catastrophe for Europe, for Poland in particular, and for us all. But after 1989, thanks to the efforts, particularly of the Poles, we were able to return with Europe, arm in arm with our allies and friends, to this vision of a West of expanding freedom. Now that is a great achievement. Europe has known a generation of general prosperity, democracy, and security, and we are, since 1945, in the longest period of general European peace since Roman times. And to that general peace, as I said, 100 million Europeans have joined themselves. And the Ukrainians, judging by the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk's inspiring speech, wish nothing more than to join this free world. That is what is at stake. The Ukrainians on the Maidan, as I recall, were waving the European Union flag. Not the American flag, not the NATO flag, the flag of a united Europe. That, to me, an American, that is inspiring. For them, a united Europe was a civilizational objective, an inspiration. They believed in Europe, they believed in the West, they believed in us, more, it seems, sometimes, than we believe in ourselves. For there are voices, I am afraid, in America, but also in Europe, who take this vision and this great achievement of our common civilization and say, so what, who cares, we don't need it. That, to me, as an American who has worked in this part of the world for many years, profoundly depressing. Because there is an alternative, of course, to the free world. It is the world of power politics, of spheres of influence, of repression, secret police, disinformation, arrests, and permanent repression, more or less forever. That alternative exists. That is Mr. Putin's vision of the world. And he holds it up as an alternative to our own vision. I believe that we in the West, the transatlantic community, need to take our own side in this fight. That is what is at stake in Ukraine. The Ukrainians want to join our community because they believe in us. We need to believe in ourselves. Thanks to the efforts of President Hollande, Chancellor Merkel, but most of all the Ukrainian people themselves, Ukraine has time and space to try to deepen its reforms and remain free and sovereign. And if it succeeds, if Ukraine succeeds in its reforms, and if we in the transatlantic community respond right and defend Ukraine's right to have a voice in its own future, then we will have acted not only in our own interests and the interests of the Ukrainians, but quite possibly in the interests of a better Russia. We will not have acted in the interests of Putinism. In fact, in my personal opinion, Putinism cannot survive a successful, free, Europeanizing Ukraine. I do not think the Russian people will allow themselves to be ruled by despots if they see Kyiv, a city with which the Russians have a great feeling, succeeding as a free and prospering capital of a free and prospering country. There's a lot at stake in Ukraine. When we look around the world, there are a number of problems which simply seem to me where a good solution is out of reach. In Syria, for example, we passed good a long time ago. The best option in Ukraine is not good, and it gets worse from there. But in Ukraine, a good outcome is achievable. It's achievable. That is worth an investment. I hope we make it, and I welcome this conference. I think it is the right conference at the right time, and I thank you, Paweł, for organizing it and for this invitation.
Proszę Państwa, mamy przy stole jeszcze...
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have here some actors of recent events. So let me address my questions to the participants in these events, following which we'll have time for questions, comments. So I have been asked if we couldn't attempt some deeper analysis of potentially different scenarios which could have taken place if Europe had reacted differently to the events. Today, if it took a more optimistic stance. So I would like to ask Borys Tarasyuk if such an alternative scenario had been feasible. Based on your experience in the diplomatic area, could Europe or the US have done more to provide an umbrella to protect Ukrainian reforms? Or do you assess the former events less critically?
Thank you. Thank you, Paweł, for your question and for your efforts to organize these conferences and the program. Speaking about the possible alternative scenarios, I think that they did exist. And from my point of view, with all due respect to France and Germany, who initiated Normandy or Minsk format, which, by the way, after 3 years doesn't work. I think that the more promising alternative scenario was demonstrated by the meeting in Geneva, April 2014, when such global actors as the United States and the European Union as an institution got together. So unfortunately, this format did not start working. From my point of view, there is only one power in the world capable to present the counterbalance to aggressive Russia. That is the United States. So, I do hope that the active involvement of the US Special Representative Kurt Volker will make the situation different. About the United States, we may speak about two administrations. One administration, the previous administration, missed the opportunity to assert the United States as a global leader. As a result, Russia felt itself free to do whatever they wanted to. And I see the picture the following way: since 2008, that the evil scenarios are being written down in the Kremlin, and the outside world are acting as an actors in implementing, sometimes resisting, but not successfully. It seemed to me that the current US administration is doing differently and more favorably in the interest of Ukraine. So the decision finally of the White House to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons is a clear demonstration of difference of the records of two administrations. In principle, I think that what the previous administration did, the previous administration was a leader in organizing the countries of the free world, democratic countries, to impose sanctions on Russia. And in this regard, I would like to express gratitude especially to Dan Fried for the job he have done while in the State Department. To finish with, I would say that the alternatives are always possible. So much depends on the actors and the political will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to return to the question by Professor Pawlikowski and ask Danylo Lubkivsky, who was one of the actors more in the shadow. So maybe you can tell us more than Mr. Yatsenyuk. Well, concerning the policy of our government, it is an experience to be in charge of or part of a government who participate in important events. Well, maybe you made some errors, and that you can say today that you would have behaved differently. Maybe you have a different view than Mr. Arsenyuk.
For organizing this event and for having this brilliant discussion, and I would like to say that those speeches that open our talk, you know, they leave me with many impressions. As we had many impressions during those times when Ukraine was attacked. And let me say that I would like to thank Borys Tarasyuk, Foreign Minister Borys Tarasyuk, for mentioning the efforts that we did together with Arseniy, together with Ambassador Deshtytsa, who is present here, then Foreign Minister of Ukraine, with our Foreign Ministry team, when we tried together with our American and European partners, to establish the Geneva format. That was the way how to react to the Russian aggression. What we thought at that moment, certainly we appealed to those who signed the Budapest Memorandum. I believe that that was a bedrock for all our efforts, how to react and how to counter the Russian Federation and the Kremlin aggression. We focus on that, and I still feel pain that we didn't receive those results that, in my mind, in my opinion, could have been natural as a reaction of the West. I believe that certainly Putin's mindset covers Ukraine. He doesn't need Donbass, he doesn't need even Crimea in some certain way. He needs Ukraine. But then, I believe that he certainly thinks he overcomes that. I believe that his eye is on Poland, is on Eastern Europe, and certainly his, as I believe, and it could be quite possible, that he understands his historic mission as an attempt to reach a failure of the West. And if we want to meet that, I would say, threat, we will certainly see that there are a number of options how to deal with that. And I believe that incorporation, involvement, integration of Ukraine into the West security, political, economic space and structures is certainly a key how to counter the threat which we face right now. Let me say that 100 years, and I'm happy that we are meeting today, 100 years Poland declared its independence. And I would like to congratulate all my Polish friends, since my heart is here in Warsaw, and I love this country and this nation. But let me also say that 100 years ago, there was another country which declared its independence, but failed. That was Ukraine. His Beatitude mentioned a reason to have a people's front in some certain way, as you said, meaning the domestic policies of Ukraine. At those times, 100 years ago, there was certainly a front against Ukraine waged by Russia. But let me mention now another elephant in the room that we do not speak about right now. There was also the second front against Ukraine. That was a front from the West, when Ukraine failed, since it was attacked not only by Russia, but by those, I believe, who at that time didn't realize how important Ukraine's independence is. Since the failure of Ukraine's independence then led to the collapse of Poland in some certain way, and then to the Second World War, since the Soviet Union appeared, since Russia was strengthened enough to play with European politics. This is my biggest concern now, since, as Paweł asked me, since I recollect the memories of those days in 2014. At that moment, we thought about the front and aggression waged against Ukraine by Russia. Now, my biggest concern is that misunderstanding that may appear in our relationship with Poland, with Hungary, with those partners that we admire and we would like to support, may bring a message that would be disastrous, not only for us, but for you, but for the West, but for those who right now feel the pressure and I would say the threat and danger which Kremlin thinks about and trying to move ahead against us. I do thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję. Proszę Państwa.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a few themes that have emerged. So the Normandy framework, or could the Geneva framework have existed at the time when the Normandy framework was formulated, was there an alternative formula available, and the balance of the relations with the EU. A few words have been said about that too, the association agreement and the visa-free movement, the free trade extended agreement. So there's a lot of elements here on the table. We've got great experts here with us, so let's hear comments, questions to our speakers. And if I may begin with Professor Wolczuk, that was my intention. But Professor Umland wants to take the floor first. Over to you. So, short comments, please, on the issues that you think are most paramount. Best ended with a question, because that's our method to use those.
Thank you very much for this exciting conference and opportunity. What seems to be actually it's a subject of so much discussion, what happened in the spring of 2014 and how did we know what was happening and how have we responded? And I think from that point of view, Ukraine has been a steep learning curve for the West in general in terms of actually what the military strategists called the plausible deniability. When we don't know what we know and we have to take decisions and we refrain from taking them because we don't have full information. And I remember meeting someone from the Foreign Office in March 2014 and asking about, from the Ministry of Defense in the UK, about hybrid warfare. And the lady said, we knew we should have done our homework, we should have prepared for it. Now we are facing real facts on the ground and we know that we are not ready. And this is the situation that now, 4 years on, we have to live with the consequences. And the fact that little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So from that point of view, actually the consequences of having to act fast, and if anything, life forcing us to act and think even faster. But this is in the context what the ambassador said of, and I think this comes very strongly from the Ukrainian participants, of Ukraine, and there are basically two narratives about Ukraine in Europe. One is, are we free to choose from Ukraine? Are we a fully sovereign state, or are we in the sphere of influence? Versus what I call the sort of, perhaps the autoimmune disease in the EU, we forced Ukraine to choose. And the fact that actually if you go to academic conferences, many experts, many scholars still argue that Ukraine was forced to choose by the EU. And those are people from the EU arguing that. Which means basically they said the degree sort of Euromasochism. If you don't know, if in doubt, blame yourself. We are here single-minded, and there's a nice Ukrainian word, odnodumci, but there are many people outside, and as someone who has worked on Ukraine for a long time, it's actually hard work because you know, and yet you are talking to people who need to be persuaded. But I would like just to focus perhaps on something which escapes attention when we focus on the military side of things, is the fact that both Russia and the EU have really lived up to the expectations in the full sort of sense, as sort of almost the people on the Maidan have expected them to do. What we've seen outside the military sphere, the EU has really unleashed its transformative power in Ukraine. In terms of Ukraine, money for Ukraine is not a problem. It's a problem how to use them effectively and not taking no from politicians who regard reforms as optional. And it's the EU acts for the people of Ukraine rather than, in many respects, Ukrainian politicians. So the EU has been very dynamic, very strategic, and really tailoring its assistance to Ukraine and the Europeanization of Ukraine. I was in the European Parliament last week. There was a meeting. The majority of people were French. That would not have been the case 4 years ago. French officials dominated the meeting on Ukraine. So the EU at the sub-political level has really developed this support for rebuilding the Ukrainian state. Having said that, Russia has also delivered in terms of actually, what we have to accept, that Russia has paid a massive price itself, not least by having to act against Ukraine in the way it has acted, in terms of undermining the bloc it created and to which it wanted to attract Ukraine. I mean the decline, the demise of the Eurasian economic integration as such. Russia has violated the rules of the institution it created in order to punish Ukraine. So from that point of view, actually, we have even more complicated, and it's perhaps more surprising on the European continent, that many people still see, despite, or rather because of the military dimension, the issue of technocratic solutions to Ukraine's crisis. In terms of actually thinking that if we change food safety standards, the crisis may be gone, or if we engage with the Eurasian Economic Union. So pragmatic deal-making seems to be still sort of an idea how to solve the crisis, and not really looking up to the challenges we face on the European continent when it comes to this transition from, and I think that Mr. Ambassador said it, what we see Ukraine being the battleground for this problematic transition from the unipolar world to the multipolar world, and Ukraine having basically the right to choose. And from that point of view, the significance of Ukraine, I very much agree, is much bigger than just sort of, you know, with all respect to Ukraine, it's actually much bigger for the world order as such. But I'm really puzzled by this issue of, what's so interesting about the issue of power. I mean, for the EU, the main problem is that the EU is a post-geopolitical entity. It has developed political dialogue as a way to overcome wars and crises. And yet we hear now there are limits to the political dialogue, what it can achieve. We need to show strength. And yet, how do we overcome? And 4 years on from the onset of the Ukraine crisis, I don't feel we have actually the toolbox. So we talk the talk, but we don't walk the walk. So I would be very much too keen to hear how do we develop that strength and leadership which was mentioned, and yet we don't seem to have it. Thank you.
Perhaps I could come in at this point on the question of the EU's strength. The EU may not have much strength in the military field, but it certainly has plenty of strength in the economic field. So the question I would now like to raise is just how effective have sanctions against Russia been for the development of the situation in Ukraine?
Proszę bardzo. Później Andreas Umland.
Okay, over to you. And then Andreas Umland.
Full disclosure, I worked with the European Union on the design, and Europe, including France, Poland, Germany, others, on the design of the sanctions. So I'm not a disinterested party answering your question. I would say that sanctions succeeded in 2 areas and failed in a third. They succeeded in convincing Putin that the West would resist, and he probably abandoned his more extravagant ambitions. Remember Novorossiya? I think he wanted to take over about half of Ukraine. I think the sanctions convinced him, well, the resistance of the Ukrainians, first of all, but the sanctions also convinced Putin to retreat from that objective. That's one thing they succeeded in doing. The second thing sanctions succeeded in is convincing Putin to agree to the Minsk framework. Now, Minsk versus Geneva. Look, I participated in the Geneva discussions on Georgia. The United States is present, so is the EU. They have produced 0. The problem is not the forum. The problem is that Putin doesn't want a solution. Not yet. And this is where the sanctions have not yet succeeded. Putin is perfectly happy to continue things as they are. He retreated. He agreed to a formula which would solve the Donbass problem, but he has not actually agreed to settle. The sanctions could and should be increased. Sanctions against Russian aggression on Ukraine, and in a new area, we, the United States and Europe, should probably be increasing sanctions in response to Russian aggression, not against Ukraine, but against us all. Our election system, not just the United States, but France. I'm thinking of other places. We have those tools, and those are not American unilateral tools. We need to exercise them in conjunction with the European Union. I think we can, I think we should. We could do more with respect to the sanctions against Ukraine, but I think we need to look at Russian threats more broadly and take action accordingly.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. Andreas, over to you, please.
I wanted to follow up on 2 points that Kataryna made about the larger importance of Ukraine and also about the однодумцы, because I think what we are here, all people basically on the same page. We have a similar attitude towards Ukraine and European values, but outside this room, I think there are probably many people who may think that this is very unfortunate what happened to Ukraine, but at the end of the day, it's not something that concerns me, or that even what happened to international law, it's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, how does it really concern myself and individual persons? And while it is odd that Russia has violated principles of the United Nations and the OSCE, which it has founded itself, it's a co-founder of these organizations, it is sort of a theoretical, almost abstract question here to discuss about the international dimensions of this, because it's not really something related to the fate of people outside Ukraine or outside Eastern Europe, let's say. What I wanted to do here is very briefly to come back to what Danylo already mentioned, the Budapest Memorandum and the importance of the memorandum, because it is often said that, well, you know, this is a document, it's an international document, but it's not a treaty, it's not ratified, and it doesn't really speak of guarantees, as in the English version at least, as Ukrainians like to have it, but of security assurances, and that is, so to say, only a relatively important document. But the problem here, of course, is that the Budapest Memorandum is linked to perhaps one of the most important treaties of humanity in general, namely the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968. And the link between the Budapest Memorandum and the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signified by the signature of Great Britain under this Budapest Memorandum, although Britain had not been part of the trilateral negotiations before the signing of the Budapest Memorandum. It was sort of a, you could say, redundant signature in that Britain was as I said, not involved in that. And second, Ukraine has, of course, not only signed the Budapest Memorandum, but also the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, which is a ratified treaty and not just a memorandum. And in addition, moreover, France and China as the two other official nuclear weapon states under the non-proliferation treaties have issued special declarations in parallel to the Budapest Memorandum, assuring Ukraine of their respect of the territorial integrity and on political sovereignty. And I think the importance here is, and that is something that I was missing a little bit, for instance, in the Rada Declaration of spring 2017, when the Rada appealed to the United States to give it the major non-NATO ally status and mentioned the Budapest Memorandum, and mentioned the Budapest Memorandum rather in relation to to Ukraine's fight for liberation and freedom and so on. What is missing here is that the violation of the Ukrainian territorial integrity also violates the integrity of the non-proliferation regime, and that Russia has turned the whole logic of the non-proliferation regime on its head, namely that it has, as an official nuclear weapon state, attacked a non-nuclear weapon state, and that, of course, the very fact that Ukraine had no nuclear weapons and Russia had nuclear weapons played a huge role in the whole conflict, and that, so to say, the non-proliferation regime has actually has been an instrument for you could say, for Russia to execute its it's the annexation of a territory to enlarge its state's territory, and also to secure then this annexation from outside intervention, because it's quite obvious that outside powers have not sent their troops to Crimea or to the Donbas because they are afraid of the nuclear weapons that Russia has, and that Russia is allowed to have under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And here, so to say, the general asymmetry of the Non-Proliferation Treaty has been used by Russia to execute this annexation, and moreover, the violation of this of the logic of the regime has then been also enhanced by China's refusal to vote in the spring 2014 United Nations General Assembly voting on the annexation, where China did not vote against the resolution condemning the annexation, but it did also not support it. So I think that is the larger importance of this whole thing, which actually concerns everybody, people, every human being, because it puts under question the whole issue of non-proliferation. And for instance, countries surrounding China, they may ask now themselves and that have no nuclear weapons, what their future is, what the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of their future is. And I could imagine that in the future, this behavior of Russia and also partly China may trigger then various politicians around the world to think about maybe getting nuclear weapons, because obviously the non-proliferation regime is not suitable for protecting their territorial integrity and political sovereignty.
Paweł, if I may, sorry to get into that discussion.
Krótka interwencja.
Absolutely brief. But let me add to what Andreas said. Not only Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum, but let me remind you that Belarus and Kazakhstan did the same. Should they feel more protected now? Should we expect that, for instance, some minds in the Kremlin would think that, no, as they call, assurances of security are workable right now? So should they move ahead? Should both nations in Belarus and Kazakhstan feel safe? So this is the question which is raised in the 21st century. Even the South Africa, which followed Ukraine's example in the sense of nuclear disarmament, should they think about those consequences? Thank you.
Interwencje, teraz Przemysław.
Thank you very much for this intervention. Przemysław Żurawski, Grajewski, your comment.
Ladies and gentlemen, in fact, we have a dozen of issues, so each of them would demand a separate conference to be described. I would limit myself to the three main issues.
Ale większość z tych tematów będziemy jeszcze...
But most of these will be discussed over the next 2 days, so please, we invite you to stay with us.
Historical issues of the first Ukrainian national revolutions just after the First World War. I would say only one sentence about that. Please remember that Hałyczyna was called very often Ukrainian Piedmont, Ukrainian Sardinia, and the Kingdom of Sardinia won the independence and national unity for Italy in the alliance with France, paying for that. And as far as another part of history is concerned, en ce qui concerne le rôle qui a été joué par l'armée.
The role of the Red Army during the Second World War. That was perceived not since 1941, but since 1939. Our memory here is very much different.
So, to understand the developments in 2014 is the answer to the question of the real reasons, real motives behind Russian action. And having such an outstanding specialist on the history of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the 18th century, Professor Butterwick-Pawlikowski, I would dare to say that Ukraine played the role of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at that time, namely being the source of freedom, being something that is completely unacceptable from the point of view whether absolutistic monarchies at the end of 18th century or Putin's regime today, not due to the international game, but due to the very internal reasons. I mean, the success of Ukrainian reform, the example that Ukrainians can give to Russian people that perceived Ukrainians in their own imperial way, that's another issue, yeah, but who perceived Ukrainians as, in fact, Russians. Yeah? So that Putin idea that democracy, market economy, freedom, personal dignity is something contradictory to traditional Ruski mir, to traditional culture. If it is falsified by Ukrainian success, that would undermine the internal stability of Russian regime, and this is the main source of the aggression, just like Constitution of May the 3rd was at the end of the 18th century. This is why we have no carrot to be offered to Putin, because he is playing for his own existence, in fact. So the success of Ukrainian reforms, in fact, depends on capacity or lack of capacity of the creation of military protection to the entire process. We cannot protect it by talking, because that's the game for life from the point of view of Kremlin's Silovik elites. And please remember that according to Russian sociologist Olga Krishtanovskaya, more than 70%, I guess 78% of Russian political elites of today are former officers of KGB and GRU, and that shapes their nature of the perception of the world. The second very important issue just mentioned by the other speakers are the contemporary Polish-Ukrainian relations. I think we should stick to reality and not to the impression that is made by really existing, but in fact of the secondary importance as far as material reality is concerned, however very important as far as psychological reality is concerned, contradictions about history. But what is tangible material political reality after 2015? We have an agreement between our national banks, about 1 billion euros of swap. We have the very well developed military cooperation, both in the Polish-Ukrainian, Lithuanian brigade, unlikely Polish-Ukrainian battalion that was dissolved in 2010. Now we recreated cooperation on the upper level. We have the military training cooperation by Polish Highland Brigade and Parachute Brigade. This is, I guess, fifth term now, that never existed before, both bilateral and within NATO framework, with Americans, with Canadians, with Lithuanians. This is very well developed cooperation. Polish military industry supplies Ukrainian armored vehicles with military optic. We have a common design Polish-Ukrainian battle tank that was presented last September in Kielce. We have 68 foreign workers in Poland. 68% of foreign workers in Poland are Ukrainians. There are no important incidents among them. They are perceived commonly as a very, yes, I'm sure. Yeah. There are minor problems, if there are any, and they were protected by the new law that was adopted last year by Polish Parliament, upgrading the legal protection of their rights as labor force in Poland. 54% of foreign students at Polish universities are Ukrainians. That is a great investment in our future, because that would help to build up better understanding between our elites in the future. And there is a very rapid expansion of business. I mean, our national flight company lot is just opening the 6th link in Ukraine, this time in Zaporozhye. We had just opened, this is the Ukrainian... Okay, but we are talking all the time about all the bad things. Let me tell what is really achieved after 2015. If anybody can produce a similar list showing that before 2015, I will be very glad. Yeah? But that is reality, material reality. Last thing. That is something that we have to pay homage to Ukrainian partners. Ugr-Żeleznica opened two very important railway connections from Kyiv to Przemysl and from Odessa to Przemysl, thus helping to reduce the problem of border transit, because that's all the time the conditions on the common border are poor and they should be improved. And the last thing, you have mentioned about the Gazprom action against Ukraine just a few days ago. In a few hours, Polish national company PGNiG signed the agreement with Naftogaz and participated together with our partners from Slovakia and Hungary in assisting Ukraine in that situation. So please distinguish between really existing problem, which is psychological, and which is political in that sense that please do not have any doubts about a positive attitude of Polish government towards Ukraine. We all understand that without Ukraine we would have Russian Empire at our border, which means probably 20 years more, and then we will be in the same prison, or we will continue our historical debate in Kołyma in one lager, or lying
with all our emotions.
Or lying in the same grave with bullets in the back of our heads.
Polsko-ukraiński jest sam w sobie, więc
this reality is shaped by political capacity or the lack of capacity to build up the public support in democratic country for the only reasonable policy on the Ukrainian issue. That means the policy of supporting Ukraine. Yeah? But we need Ukrainian support to build up public support in Poland to continue that policy. Thank you.
Professor, unfortunately, I need to interrupt you, although we're all fascinated by the issue of Polish and Ukrainian relations, but it's a good forum to talk about it. We will still have the time to elaborate. We will have time to voice your reactions. And now let me ask to what extent the events in Ukraine are stimulating for the Russian society. To what extent a good example from Ukraine may change the Russian society. I know it's a tough topic, but we've got here Professor Gretskiy from St. Petersburg. Please say a few words about that, and I will then give the floor to the ambassador.
And, well, I agree with the point that Putinism won't survive free and democratic Ukraine. That's biggest threat, because at the beginning of 1990s, Russian political establishment strived to present a positive model of Russia's future. And an example for that was the West, the Western community. The most popular idea back in 1990s and even now among the Russian society is to live and consume in accordance with the European standards of living. And that's it. Well, it was clear in 1992, 1993 that, well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the still Soviet mentally, citizens of former Soviet republics, they considered that they would live in prosperity within the next several days, probably weeks. And the reality was very cruel. They just felt frustrated. And then they got back to other philosophy. they understood that the West is very, very far, far away. But the example of Ukraine, I mean, if Ukraine succeeds, if it prevails, then it would mean that the successful reforms and transformation from the Soviet style of living is possible. But I would like to get us to bring us back to the matter of sanctions, because until the sanctions are on the table, are intact, any kind of reforms in Russia, they are impossible, just impossible. Sanctions is a very tricky issue and very, I'd say, lots of discussions about that are nowadays. But the absence of sanctions is much worse than the presence of sanctions. Why? Because back in 1968, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. And what was the response of the West? No sanctions. And that encouraged the warmongers in the Kremlin that roamed the Kremlin's corridors when there was a debate over the decision whether to invade Afghanistan or not. Brezhnev was sure that the West would do nothing. Why? Because the West had done nothing back in 1968. So any kind of sanctions should be introduced, but the West is limited in its ability to introduce sanctions. Why? Because neither in the end of 1980s nor now, the West hasn't found an answer to the question how to deal with a collapsing and crumbling nuclear power. The superpower that possesses the nuclear power. What to do? And this was an experience of Gorbachev. And Putin learned this lesson, and he knows that it won't be him who would be obliged to save Russia from the collapse. It would be the West who will come to rescue the collapsing Russia. And he knows that. And that means that he can raise the stakes just as many times as he wants. That's a very great, that's why the West is limited in introducing sanctions. Another point I would like to make, I would like to bring us back to the year of 2014, because it was not a benchmark, not only in Ukraine's history, but in Russia's as well, because it meant the invasion in Ukraine and the legal annexation of Crimea. It meant that Russian diplomacy doesn't matter. It just doesn't count in the process of the decision making while the decision is made. Lavrov was absent when the decision to annex Crimea was undertaken. And what it means that since 2014, the main export facility of Russia is an export of threats. Export of threats. And that's and the West still doesn't know how to deal with that, actually. Before the year of 2014, Russia was very vocal while criticizing the United States and its foreign policy, but still, Putin upheld the very constructive and rational relationship with the European leaders. After 2014, this opportunity just disappeared from him. The door is closed. There is no European country that, well, probably there are some, but not too many, who are ready nowadays to deal with Russia on bilateral basis, frameworks, only multilateral. And Poland is the case, actually. And this is extremely very important because when we talk about what's gonna happen in future, what can we do? I mean, how to react the current situation in the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Of course, the West should stop buying threats from Russia. But on the other hand, there is no answer to the question how to deal with the crumbling major power, a state that possesses a nuclear weapon. And unfortunately, Mr. Yatsenyuk is absent now, but I would like to take an opportunity to pass a question to him personally, because the year 2014 to me is very important to the European history. And there was a, when the Revolution on Dignity was on the way, and the Ukrainian government was clearly aware about Russia's actions in different regions of its country, there was a very strange initiative to bring in the Verkhovna Rada's agenda the issue of languages. And it had been done by the by the proponents of the Revolution of Dignity. And if I were in Ukrainian politicians' shoes, I wouldn't do this, because Russia, the next day, the draft law to abolish the law on language policy adopted back in 2012 had been introduced. The next day, Russian media and Russian government used this to justify its actions in Ukraine. They said that Russia should protect Russian-speaking population, and so on and so forth. And in the end, this law hadn't been adopted. But still, that's my question. Why did the Verkhovna Rada decide to talk on that issue in that very, very difficult situation? Thank you.
I'm in a difficult position because everybody is heated up for discussion, but we have this subject matter foreseen for later on, for the afternoon. We will be all together later. We will have opportunity to discuss languages, but now I'd like to invite Stefan Gullgren, and then we'll have time for the President, the Prime Minister, the Archbishop, and the Ambassador, following which it will be already late for lunch. So all this is taking quite a long time. So I will give people the floor, but I appeal for brevity. Stefan Gullgren, please.
Thank you, Paweł. You take a big risk asking a diplomat to be brief. But I will do an attempt. I'm not going to repeat what has been said, and I agree with most of it, but I'd like to make a remark on two challenges that I think are important. One general challenge and one more specific. And the first is, and based on what we have seen over the past years and lessons that we can learn from 2014 and onwards, is that for our response to an aggression like Russia's aggression to Ukraine to be effective, we need to create the right context within which the aggressor will change its calculation. As it is, and as it were, Russia apparently calculated that the cost of aggression would be less than the gains. And until we can change that cost-benefit analysis, it will not be possible to, in my view, get full implementation of the Minsk agreements, because they have a very specific purpose, as has been discussed here. And I think France and Germany has made a tremendous effort on a very difficult task. But the specific purpose of the Minsk agreements is to provide a roadmap for Russia to exit eastern Ukraine. It's not a solution, a broader solution by themselves. We need a context within which Russia would deem it to be in their interest to implement Minsk. And I think what it all boils down to is successful Ukrainian reforms. That is, the continuation and completion of the reform effort launched by Arseniy Petrovich's government, and the fact that they will persuade not only Russia but also the European Union and the United States and others that this is an irreversible process, that Ukraine will follow through on its aspiration of changing the country, which is, of course, Russia's main objective, to prevent it from doing and to prevent it from being successful. So the challenge is how we can bring that about. Of course, we need a Ukrainian effort to support, obviously. So the reforms need to be maintained. They need to be, I would say, perhaps in some areas even increased. For example, the fight against corruption, how to limit the influence of the vested interests and so on. That will definitely make it possible for the European Union to keep Ukraine high on the agenda. It will make it possible for the EU to remain united on sanctions, and it will also provide a good basis for transatlantic unity, because we do have unity so far on sanctions, but there is a room, I think, for more of EU, US, Canadian, others cooperation in supporting Ukrainian reforms. If we can make that case credible, that we have a sustained support for sustained Ukrainian reforms, then I think over time this could be a more powerful sanction against Russia than the sanctions as we normally talk about them. Because the important thing is that there should be consequences for the kind of action that Russia has undertaken in Ukraine. The cost comes in different shapes, in sanctions, as we normally describe them, but also in the inability to achieve the strategic objectives, which in this case was the failure of Ukraine, and the fact that Russia thought that Ukraine would then come back into its orbit. And that leads me to the second challenge that I think we face, and that's more specific. And that is how we can deal with Russia's misconceptions. The fact that Russia still seems to think that the strategy and above all the tactics that it uses actually work. And if you look at the situation in Ukraine, I don't serve there any longer, but the way I know the country and what I also see and hear is that Ukraine has never been more united than it is today. And the support for European integration has never been higher, and the support for NATO perspective has never been higher. And the support for integration with Russia has never been lower. So strategically, it is quite obvious to me at least that Russia has failed if the purpose was to bring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit. But it doesn't seem that Moscow sees it that way. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't know what's best for it, but this is definitely a misconception, since it doesn't work in relation to Ukraine and it doesn't work in relation to us. And I don't really know how we can deal with this misconception other than dealing with the bigger challenge that I mentioned, namely to sustain Ukrainian reforms and to show that we are resilient and resolved to do that over time. And over time, I am convinced that this is going to be a successful policy, because I fully agree with Dan Fried. This is achievable. There are some other international situations which are less achievable, but this is certainly achievable, and it's also something that I believe we have to do, because this is not only about Ukraine, as has been said. This is about international law and the European security order, and we in Europe have to decide whether we want a Paris Charter Europe or a Vienna Congress Europe. And my country is definitely, as you can all understand, in favor of a Paris Charter Europe. And I think that's also the predominant view in Europe as such.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry. Time is running. So if our keynote speakers would honor us by a summary, may I ask the President, the Prime Minister, the Archbishop and the Ambassador to wind up. Jeżeli dobrze rozumiem, zmierzamy ku konkluzjom, które mogą być krótkie, bezpośrednie i szczere nawet. The conclusions may be both brief and frank. We need to take a global perspective, not look just towards the west of Europe to analyze today's Russia. That's we need to find the key in our approach. What determined Ukraine was the decision by President Obama not to intervene in Syria. Faced by the chemical attack by Assad, supported by Russia, so from outside Syria, the fact that there was no strong reaction of the international community, I mean a military reaction to this, was interpreted by Bashar al-Assad as allowance for massacring his own people, which continues until today, and for Putin that he could intervene wherever he wished in the name of his own interests, and that's what has also resulted in Ukraine. So thinking only of Western Europe as a determinant factor is wrong. You have to look at what is happening also worldwide and in the Middle East. We need to have a global perspective. Secondly, thinking that President Trump could provide security and support at every instance and occasion is wrong, regardless of his intentions. So you have to keep that in mind. And Putin versus Ukraine. Well, the Ukrainian government and most of its parliament are vulnerable. The majority in parliament. They are vulnerable both economically and politically, and maybe it's an error of the analysis of Ukrainian population. But Putin thinks that by hurting the Ukrainian population, he will arrive at the result of having a Ukraine more susceptible to Russian pressure. And the belief that, hence our belief that Europe and the US should support Ukraine financially in proper governance to enable Ukraine to resist to Russian pressure. But also Ukrainians' policy must be up to the challenge to prevent the opportunity for Europe to undermine it. And concerning sanctions, of course, they have their limits, they are well known, but they are also insufficient. Let's be frank. The only sanction which would hurt Russia is the energy policy. The ability of Russia to sell its oil and gas. And who is buying it? We all know. So if we just stopped buying oil and gas from Russia, we would create an extremely difficult, if not impossible, situation for the Russian authorities. So, do we want to go that far? After all, there are other countries which produce oil and gas. But we see very well that in Europe it's very difficult to arrive at this result. So that's why I mentioned French exports of armaments, which is important for our industry. So we step back from selling Mistrals to Russia, and we must recognize that we also have economic interests in Russia. But if we want to exert pressure, we should go that far as to be effective. Looking at Syria, Putin has achieved destabilizing our allies. And we see that he is also undermining stability among our countries, which we see currently in Britain. So we can see that there is strong support for Russia also in Europe. Putin has relations with all populist extreme parties in Europe. So we should be able also ideologically and politically to resist Russia and to apply sanctions to the level adequate to the threat or to the situation. With regards to Russian nationalism, which of course exists and on which Putin is playing, especially during elections, and he's very happy with the situation where Russia is being attacked, being accused, and he can present it to public opinion as a kind of foreign approach against Russia. So Putin pretended that there were no Russian forces in Syria and that the poisonous gases applied there were not produced in Russia, but according to simulation, so we have quite major, at least disinformation, if not public lies. So it's very important that the people of Russia should understand the distinction between the Russian nation and their authorities in our approach and actions. So they should seek economic convergence and a better level of life, which we wish them as their friends. So I think I'm talking too long. We still have two points to speak on, 4 and 5. So I'm raising the 4th point on the United States, which develop a protectionist policy, which surely should not lead to interventionism, because it leads rather to isolation. And Europe, if it doesn't want, in this impossible situation in which it is today between a Russian aggressive stance and unclear US policy to be without its own force. So for the minimum effectiveness, Europe needs its own power. Thank you very much. Mr. Prime Minister.
So on the Minsk process, we strongly believe that we need the United States to be on board in trying to find the way, not just how to implement the Minsk, but how to restore territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. Let me just remind you that there is a new idea on the surface, which is to deploy a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, which has nothing to do with the Minsk process. Show me any piece of language in the Minsk deal over the peacekeeping operation. So it entirely changes the table, including this entirely changes even negotiating table over the way how to pass UN Security Council resolution on the peacekeeping operation in Ukraine. Somebody mentioned that the door for President Putin is closed in the free world. I would be happy to have the same closed door for myself. Everybody is talking to Putin. Everybody is meeting Putin. Everybody is in close touch with Putin. So is there any kind of isolation, real strong isolation of President Putin? No. No. And the guy is trying to play himself as a very masculine, very strong leader. And let's be frank, it's important not to underestimate the enemy. He is doing quite well. So he is attacking us, he is attacking you, he is humiliating the free world, he is humiliating the global leaders, and you guys absorb this? You are fine with this? So, a concerted and strong actions are needed. Very strong actions. Sanctions. No doubt that sanctions are important. Just let me remind you that, as far as I remember, in 2006, the world imposed sanctions on North Korea, right? And as far as I remember, today North Korea have ICBMs that can easily reach the mainland of the United States. Should we draw the lessons out of this? So if we impose sanctions, sanctions have to block, to stop, to press, and then to bring these bad folks back to the negotiating table. So in the end, we expect to have North Korea at the negotiating table with the President of the United States. So as far as I understand, this is the fast lane, how to get the meeting with the President of the United States. Just to have a nuclear arsenal, a nuclear power, and not to sign any kind of Budapest memorandums. So I'm telling you about the mixed signals, strange mixed signals. And in this chaotic world, who is to succeed? People like President Putin or people like the leader of the North Korea, Kim Jong-un. So it's important for us to realize that if we are united, if we are determined, if we stick to our values but not to the value, we can win. This is the only option we have on the table. We don't have anything else. To fight like hell for what we believe in and what is right in this world. And not to play any kind of tricks or to try to cut any kind of backdoor deals or to find an excuse why not to support Ukraine. I can present you a plenty. But I can tell you one very important thing. Our success is your success. Our failure is your disaster. So you are not just fighting for us, you are fighting for yourself.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much.
Żeby oddzielić może tą część.
And to separate this part, let me now give the floor to the Ambassador Fried, and I will leave the Archbishop to the very last minute to allow you some time to take distance from the political content.
If you are asking whether we should increase our resistance in the West to Russia, of course we should. And if President Hollande is suggesting opposition to, let us say, Nord Stream 2, you can sign me up. There is more we can do, there is more we should do. Prime Minister, don't fall into despair. We thought the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War right through the mid-1980s. Okay, just remember that.
I know that he will leave the office, the time will come.
We may yet win if we don't lose. Secondly, you are absolutely right to use the Polish term, Ukraine is fighting za waszą I naszą wolność. You know, to use the old the Poles are right. Solidarity will help us, nationalism will not. President Hollande is unfortunately right that economic nationalism in the form of the American steel and aluminum tariffs is not moving in the right direction. We haven't seen the end of this, however. We need to act in solidarity according to our larger principles, and then we will succeed. The final point to make is that Ukraine can do what Poland did in its time 25 years ago. Poland built for itself political capital through the success of its internal reforms. Ukrainian resistance has given you time. The Russians want all of Ukraine, and our Polish colleague is absolutely right. I think Putin's policy toward Ukraine is the same as Catherine the Great's policy toward the old Polish Commonwealth, which means the Maidan is the equivalent of the 3rd of May Constitution. Use that time. No need to tell you, you know, you were successful in your reforms. But Ukraine needs to use the time it has, that the blood of the Ukrainian people has given it, to deepen reforms. And that will actually help you in the West. You shouldn't need that kind of help. We should do it anyway, because it is in our interest. But the reforms are absolutely critical. The Russians feed on nationalism and corruption. And our success comes from successful democracy. And finally, I do not believe that the current Russia is the only possible Russia. I believe there is a better Russia that is possible. Russia is not civilizationally doomed to live according to its worst traditions. I think it can do better. And to get to that potential better Russia, we need to resist the Russia we've got today.
Thank you very much. And to round up the session, let me give the floor to the Archbishop. First of all, let me emphasize that we ourselves should be helping. We should be helping ourselves. We should be supporting one another, because if you are able to help yourself, you can count on the help of your neighbors and friends. Let me tell you the following. I also want to thank all those who have, on many levels in Europe, offered their support through sanctions towards the Russian Federation, and therefore also experiencing losses. But let me remind you that young men are dying every day in Ukraine. The war is going on, even though the headlines in Western Europe do not cover that anymore, and people think that the trouble is over and that the problems have been solved. So when you weigh your political and economic reasons, please do bear in mind that the scale comes at the price of human life, the lives of individuals in Ukraine. And thirdly, If in any of the EU countries you raise a question as to whether we can give up Russian gas entirely, please invite Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, and he will tell you about how it is possible. It was difficult before 2014 to find a country that would be so dependent on the Russian gas deliveries and oil deliveries. Ukraine was so dependent on it, and the Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk and his cabinet proved that you can get out of this addiction. I think that this applause was a great conclusion to our session. We didn't want it to go over time. It has. Lunch is ready, but I think it's been worth being here. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Prime Minister, Archbishop, Ambassador, and I would like to thank all our excellent experts, Mr. Tarasyuk. I won't list everybody. It's a friendly circle. Thank you very much, all of you.